Hello viewers, and welcome yet again to another episode of Dinner Guide. I'm your host Chef Andy, and today we're going to be incorporating some beautiful smoking techniques from home. I'm going to be showing you how to incorporate that beautiful smoky aroma to your meal, and of course show you some very simple tips and tricks of plating as well. Now before we begin, I'll of course introduce the ingredients for a very simple dish of today, which is some soy beef skewers, which we're going to be pairing with some Lyonnaise potatoes. But before we begin, a small tour of our ingredients just to give you an idea of what to expect. Now from the very front, I've got about 3 pieces of red chili. I've also got a tablespoon of some dark mushroom infused soy sauce. You'll also require about a tablespoon of some sesame seeds, about a teaspoon of some 5-spice powder, and about a teaspoon of some oregano powder, of course very dry. You'll also require some fresh rosemary and some fresh thyme, a few peppercorns, and a small teaspoon of some chili flakes. You're going to also require some beef fillet, about 4 pieces of skewers, some fresh coriander, and 1 medium-sized red onion, some 3 medium-sized potatoes already washed. You'll also require some salt and black pepper for seasoning, some sesame oil to cook with, and of course some oil to fry your potatoes in. So we're going to give you this chance to stretch and unwind, and we'll catch you after a very short break. Welcome back viewers. For those of you who missed out on the intro, we're going to be incorporating some beautiful smoking techniques that you can practice indoors. And of course, this being in the same range of ingredients and recipes that we've been focusing on that are basically based for the barbecue. But we are of course going to be focusing on some beautiful techniques that you can also bring to your cooking technique that may actually both incorporate the technique of smoking your meat and of course being able to almost bring that beautiful barbecue effect to your dish in your very own home kitchen. Now we're going to begin the process very simply by cutting our meat into some strips. And for that you will require about 300 grams of some beef fillet, which we'll begin very simply by slicing into some thick strips. So I'm slicing those into 1/4 inch in thickness. Proceed to do the same until you have about 3 skewers worth of meat, and you can of course reserve the rest that remains. And now very important, always very crucial to season your meat, or of course give it a bit of a marination. So for that we're going to begin by adding about a tablespoon of some mushroom infused soy sauce to a bowl. We'll infuse that with a bit of some sesame oil, and of course very importantly a bit of salt. But very crucial to mention, soy sauce could actually be very salty, so you should actually make a point of always making sure to go very light with soy at this particular stage, just to make sure not to over infuse your marination. Now to that we're also going to be incorporating 1 whole chili, which you will basically just cut right through the middle, and you can dump that in there. We're going to also add a few peppercorns, about 3 pieces should do for this recipe, and a small pinch of some chili flakes. And you can of course add your beef to your bowl, and very, very gently mix that through. And of course, this will need about 10 to 15 minutes of resting time, so you can actually be able to do this very, very quickly in a nick of time. Right, once that's mixed up, we're going to allow that to sit undisturbed for a few minutes at the back, bringing us to the next step of our preparation, which is our potatoes. So very, very importantly to mention, potatoes are particularly a very, very it's actually a very, very good starch to pair with some bit of ingredients such as meat, and it will actually go well with ingredients that come off your barbecue or dishes that you can be able to prepare on a barbecue. So very simply, begin by peeling your potato with a sharp knife. Of course, it always saves you the effort every time you rinse your potatoes or wash them before you peel. It will also aid you in preserving that beautiful bit of potato juice, which of course also infuses quite a bit of flavor to your dish. And this will particularly go unnoticed, especially when you peel your potatoes and you actually dump them in the water. You will always notice a little bit of sediment at the bottom, some beautiful white murky liquid. And that is particularly potato starch. It's actually very, very flavorful. And you can actually, of course, very much miss out on that. So that's particularly something you could take note of. Now we're going to proceed to peel our potatoes till we get to the very last. You can, of course, use a potato peeler if you have one available to you. And proceed to do so right up until you get to the last one. Also very important to mention, by this part of your preparation process, you should have a pot of oil already on the go, which is what we started doing earlier in the show. Right, once those are peeled, proceed to discard your peels. And of course, using an extra sharp knife, proceed to slice those into about 1/2 inch in thickness. So those should give you some nice beautiful chunks, and as I said, very, very consistent cut always assures for you to get a consistent cooking time for your potatoes. And just proceed to do the same for the other two pieces. Just to bring us to the last and final one. And you will very, very simply proceed to just wash those or rinse those in the water very, very briefly. And you can, of course, pour those into a strainer. And you can allow those to drain off very, very briefly before you proceed to add those to your oil. Remember, very important to always avoid adding or having any particular water in your oil, because it actually could spark a fire. Right now our oil is already heating up. We'll allow the potatoes to just drain off very, very briefly and proceed to cook. And now, just to bring you to the other end, we're also going to be cooking our skewers very, very differently today. Now the process I wanted to share with you all is a very, very simple technique, one that I've of course practiced over the years. And it's a very, very simple technique of infusing your meat with a bit of a smokiness to it. So you can, of course, achieve this very simply by using such ingredients as smoked paprika, which will, of course, infuse it very, very quickly. But if you're going to be cooking it in a different technique, as I'm going to do today, and you may not actually be incorporating paprika to this recipe, you're, of course, going to go with a much simpler alternative. So we're going to start off very simply by skewering our beef. So I'm just going to work a few pieces into our skewers. So I'm using about 15 centimeter skewers. This should allow for about 2 to 3 pieces of your beef. So be sure to just weave those very, very gently. Of course, always making sure to have as much as you can on a stick, very much depending on the size that you decide to go with. And just proceed to weave your meat right through And proceed to do the same for about 4 pieces of skewers or 5. And also very important to mention, you should have a very good skillet for doing so. Remember, skillet particularly carries a nice beautiful base to it, which of course brings a nice beautiful infusion and a kick of heat to your dish. And of course that extra bit of heat from your pan will of course always aid you in getting a nice cooking time to your meat. And of course the quicker you cook your meat, the more tender and juicier you will actually be able to preserve your meat. So very simply, once your skewers are done, we will begin by placing about one spring of rosemary cut in half and about 3 or 4 sprigs of some thyme. So as you can hear, the pan is quite hot, sizzling, and I'm going to add a few peppercorns to the pan, drizzle over a little bit of some oil, and it should actually start to spark very, very quickly, of course taking you to the next step of laying your skewers right over the herbs. So very, very simple technique. Begin the process by heating up your skillet or your griddle pan to a very, very hot stage, right up until you have it smoking. Then you will actually reduce your temperature at this stage and allow the meat to cook very, very gently undisturbed. You can reserve the rest of your mixture, bringing you to the next step, which is frying up your potatoes. So you can of course begin by shaking them in a strainer, or you could just dump them very, very quickly before throwing them in the oil by using some kitchen towel. And now very gently proceed to add those to your hot oil. And that should allow for you about anywhere between 5 to 6 minutes, right up your potatoes are nice and golden in color. Be sure to always give them a quick toss before you allow them to proceed cooking, just to make sure that your pieces are not stuck together. Alright, and while those 2 ingredients proceed to cook, you can very simply just give your board a wipe. And we are going to proceed to finish off the rest of our ingredients. So of course, to start off, we're going to be peeling a red onion. So begin by slicing off the ends. Make a very thin slit right through the sides. That should allow for you to get a nice even lift of the first layer of your skin. That should allow for you to peel very, very easily. Proceed to discard the skins. And very simply, we're going to proceed to julienne our onion. So begin by slicing through the middle. And once done so, place your onion flat on the board and proceed to just julienne that very, very gently. You can of course chop that a little slower to get a more precise cut, but you should be able to achieve this very, very simply with a sharp knife. Proceed to chop right up to the very end. Right, once that's done, we're going to proceed to move those to a plate. Right, simple as that, very, very easy beginning. Now at this stage we'll proceed to check on our skewers, so you can give them a gentle turn. And as I mentioned, very important to cook them very, very slowly. Remember that little bit of additional time in cooking allows it to infuse very, very gently. And of course, this particular process of cooking will also aid in keeping your meat nice and tender. Right, just to bring you back to the potatoes, we're going to proceed to check on them. And this should almost start to brown along the sides. Should give that about anywhere between 4 to 6 minutes until they're ready to take them off. But before we do so, we are going to take a very, very short break, allowing you to freshen up. And when we come back, I'll take you through the last process of finishing off the Lyonnaise potatoes, and of course give you some very, very simple serving suggestions, and of course some dietary tips. So please don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. For those of you who are just tuning in, we've just been working on the skewers. We're right about ready to start working on the Lyonnaise potatoes, which is of course my preferred alternative accompaniment for this very, very simple dish. Now we're going to begin the process by heating up a pan on the side. And to that we'll proceed to add a generous amount of oil. Remember, you are going to be sauteing some onions and some potatoes. You may actually want to make sure that you have about a tablespoon of oil in the pan. So very, very quickly allow your pan to come to the heat. And of course our skewers are now fully cooked. So we're going to be moving those onto the plate. I'm going to place those right on the side. And those are particularly very, very tender, as I mentioned, if you cook them very, very slowly. And of course, by monitoring your pan, making sure that the heat does not exceed the expected temperature, you will actually be able to get a beautiful sizzle to your meat. It will actually be able to cook very, very gently. And you may actually be able to get a more beautiful presentation to it. For those of you who may be also doing this on a barbecue, remember to first of all always dip your skewers in some water just to allow for them to be able to contain the intensity of heat. And this will of course aid you in making sure that they don't burn on the sides, making it impossible to hold your skewers once you serve. And for those of you also looking for alternatives, especially when it comes to cooking your meat, this very same technique we used, you can alternatively add a bit more herbs if you're looking for more intensity. But especially if you're going to be making small quantities of meat, you may also want to regulate the amount of herbs you place on your pan, because it could actually over-flavor your dish and over-flavor your meat, giving you one particular consistent flavor and making it hard for you to be able to grasp the rest of your ingredients. All right, so to begin the process, we'll begin by adding our onions to the pan. And just proceed to toss those while your pan is still at high heat. And that should take you anywhere between a minute to a minute and a half. And this particular process is basically just to sweat out your onions and of course reduce that pungency of the red onion. Right, once that's done, you will of course require some coriander for this recipe. So we're just going to chop that very, very coarsely. But before we proceed to add our coriander, remember, very important to mention, you may want to add that towards the very end, because this is basically just to give it a bit of color. And now very simply begin by adding your 5 spice and proceed to also add a pinch of some oregano. You can also add a small pinch of some chili flakes. This is just to give it a bit of color and heat. And proceed to toss once more. And at this stage, once you get the beautiful aromatics going, proceed to also add your potatoes. And you can proceed to toss those once more. And this will basically allow for your potatoes to begin to blend in with the flavors already in your pan. Very important to mention as well, crucial to make sure that your pan does not overheat. You may actually end up coloring your onions too quickly and of course getting your potatoes very, very dry. So proceed to toss as you continue. You can of course achieve the same results, especially if you have a spoon next to you and you may not be able to toss your pan as I'm doing on the show. You can also just give that a very, very gentle mix and you will achieve exactly the same results. Now, of course, very importantly, before finishing your dish, very important to season. So I'm going to add a pinch of salt and of course crush in some black peppercorns and just proceed to toss that once more, bringing you to the last and final ingredient, which is your chopped coriander. Proceed to toss right up until your coriander just begins to crackle on the pan, and you can proceed to turn off your heat. And these are now ready to serve. So very, very simply, proceed to use a spoon to spoon over your potatoes. Of course, very important to always give that a mix before transferring onto your plate. You can proceed to serve that right on the side. And of course, always giving your dish a bit of some compliments by piling your potatoes right over each other will always give you a nice, beautiful height. And of course, just to finish off this very simple dish, I'm going to proceed to garnish off with a bit of some rosemary and sprinkle over some sesame seeds. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is my very simple version of some soy smoked skewers with some Lyonnaise potatoes. Now, just some serving suggestions that I can also share with you. You can alternatively serve that with a beautiful glass of Chardonnay or beautiful glass of some Sauvignon Blanc. It will go very, very well with this dish. This will particularly also cover one particular portion, so you may want to make a bit of a correction if you're going to be doing this for more than one person. And of course, also to mention, you can also alternatively cook your meat as it was without the skewers. But of course, being that you're going to be incorporating this dish in a bit of a theme that incorporates also the barbecue touch of cooking, the skewers, of course, bring that beautiful authenticity to your plate. Now that, of course, brings us to the last and final part of the show. I do thank you once again for making time to join us today. But I will also remind you, we're always open to hear from you. So do share your comments, your queries, or even pictures that you take of your very own creations from home. We're always more than happy to get that little bit of feedback from you. But from now, I will bid you farewell, wishing you a lovely week and God's blessings. See you soon.